Aside from hearing you should be shooting in RAW, that's like the number one thing that you hear in the photography space. The second most common thing that you hear is that you should be shooting in manual. Now, I'm gonna start this video off being fair. I think most people, when they say shoot in manual, what they're really saying is don't shoot in full auto. But the problem, I think, is that people take shoot in manual to heart and they take it very literal. And there are quite a few photographers that I know and that I've come across that almost always shoot in manual. And I want to tell you why I almost never shoot in manual. Aside from when I'm in a controlled environment, studio, or some situation where I'm stationary, nothing is changing, I'll shoot in manual. Outside of that, I almost always shoot in aperture priority. Now, occasionally I'll shoot in shutter priority if the shutter speed is the priority, but for the most part, I shoot in aperture priority in almost all situations, portraits, events, everything. And so I want to touch on why that is, because I feel like aperture priority and shutter priority is a very powerful tool in cameras that a lot of photographers are not utilizing. Now, if I pull back for a second and I stay with, you got to shoot in manual. Let me give you a scenario. You're shooting in an event and you're shooting in manual. So right now your camera is faced this way. You've got your settings, you're getting your shots. You pan to your right or to your left, the exposure is different. So in manual, you've got to make some adjustments. You've either got to adjust your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture. You have to adjust something to account for that change in exposure. Now, you could argue that it isn't that hard to do. And if you're familiar with your camera and you've been shooting for a while, it isn't, but it still takes time. Now, if I come back to the fact that while you're shooting in manual, I'm shooting in aperture priority, I essentially have to do the same thing, right? I have to account for that exposure difference. If I pan my camera over that way, if it's in aperture priority, the camera is going to adjust on what it thinks the exposure should be. But if it's something that isn't correct or I want to creatively expose it differently, I have to make an adjustment as well. But instead of having to worry about changing the ISO or the aperture or the shutter speed, all I do is change the exposure compensation. I'm essentially just moving one dial. I'm either saying underexpose it by a stop or 2 stops, or overexpose it by a stop or 2 stops, and I let the camera figure out the rest. So really, when you stop and think about it, I pretty much shoot on auto. Okay, it is picking my shutter speed for me. It's picking my ISO because I set my ISO to auto ISO. It's doing all of that work for me. The only thing I'm telling it is that I want it to be this specific aperture. And that works really well because cameras these days are pretty good at determining what the exposure should be. Now, of course, it doesn't know how you're trying to do something. So if I'm trying to underexpose something because, I'm pointing towards a window and I want to underexpose it more, if I want to bring it up more so that way my shadows are more visible, obviously the camera's not going to know that, but that's why I can just adjust that dial for that exposure compensation and I get it every time. And I'm able to move very quickly and efficiently and still be able to get the exposure that I want. If I have it in manual, I can do the same thing, but now it's forcing me to think about what I want to change, right? If I'm only changing my shutter speed, maybe when I was over here, I had my ISO at 400, my shutter speed was at 1/100th of a second. Well, if I move over here and now all of a sudden it's too bright, now I'm like, do I want to change my shutter speed? Do I want to change my ISO? Do I want to change both? I don't really want to have to deal with changing both. So now if I'm just changing my shutter speed, I get the exposure where it needs to be, but maybe now my ISO is higher than it really needs to be. Maybe I was at 3200 ISO over here. I don't want to be shooting in a scene with a lot of light at 3200 ISO, and now my shutter speed's at 4,000th of a second or 8,000th of a second. So when you're in manual, you're having to think about all these things and make multiple adjustments when you could be shooting in your aperture priority, and your camera's gonna change all of that for you. And all you have to do is tell it expose darker or expose brighter. Now, I wanna touch on how I make this work for me. And I can only speak for Canon cameras. I would imagine that every camera brand is gonna have things similar to this, but I wanna talk about how I make this work. Now, something that I already touched on, my ISO. I keep that at auto ISO. I let the camera figure out what the ISO needs to be. Now, for some of you, you're losing your right now, right? Because you always want to shoot at base ISO. So the last thing you want to do is let your camera push the ISO. I don't care about that. I just don't. Cameras are very good with ISO these days. I just had a video on this a few weeks ago. I do not worry about ISO. So I let the camera figure that out. The second thing that I do is I set a minimum shutter speed, because what I don't want the camera to do is to have the shutter speed so slow that I'm getting motion blur or I'm getting camera shake. So I usually, depending upon what I'm shooting, if I'm just shooting an event and it's just people and it's nothing that's moving too fast, I generally will have that minimum shutter speed at 1/250th of a second. So what that means is, no matter what, asterisk, and I'm gonna come back to it, no matter what, the camera is not going to drop below 2/50th of a second. So I never have to worry about the shutter speed being too slow. I don't have to worry about the ISO. Now, the reason why I said asterisk is because if the camera is in a situation where it needs more exposure, the scene is too dark based on what it can do, it will go below that minimum shutter speed to be able to properly expose the image. So for example, if I had it set to 2/50th of a second and the ISO is maxed out at 26,500, whatever it is, obviously it can't touch the aperture because I have that set and it's aperture priority. It will go below that minimum shutter speed to try to expose the image properly, which I'm okay with, because if I'm in a situation where I'm tapped out on ISO, usually I'm shooting wide, well, I won't say usually because I don't always shoot wide open, but if I am shooting wide open and the scene is still too dark, it is what it is, okay? If I'm gonna get the scene, I'm gonna have to lower the shutter. So I'm okay with that. So my camera is picking the ISO, my camera is determining the shutter speed, and I'm setting the minimum of what that shutter speed can be, and then I am controlling the aperture. So as I'm panning around, whatever it is, where I'm pointing my camera, most of the time the camera is gonna expose it well. And if I want it to be different, I'm just gonna turn that dial and get the shot. It is so much quicker than having to make all of these adjustments manually. And let me tell you, even if you know your camera, I know my cameras. I can adjust these things without looking. I don't have to think about it, but I guarantee you, you are not going to be able to make those adjustments faster than what your camera can do. I am making a bold claim here. Try me if you want to, but you're not going to be able to change your ISO and your shutter speed faster than what your camera can do in a split second. So instead of always being on manual, utilize the power of your camera, especially modern day cameras. They're so good at figuring out these things. Capitalize on that. So instead of you having to do everything, let the camera do it. And if it doesn't get it right, or if it does get it right, but it's not quite what you want, you can just make that change in your exposure using the exposure compensation. So give it a try. Let me know how it works for you.